Hey everybody, we're going to be doing another tier maker video. This time we're going to be ranking the DS9 cast members, or the characters on DS9. We did TNG last time. Now we're going to be moving on to a show with a bit more characters. As you can see from the bottom here, there's a lot of primary stars, there's a lot of recurring guest stars, and this is not all of them. I get a lot of comments on the TNG video about, like, what about these characters? I'm not making these lists, I'm just sort of pulling them out of the tier maker website, and so everything that's here is what's here, and I'm not adding to it, or I'm not personally forgetting anything. You can lay your blame at whoever made this list. Well, let's start off with DS9, ranking the characters. A, B, C, D, F. We'll start with Jadzia. We put her here, and then we'll move her around into one of the tiers once we decide, and then we'll rank them as we sort of put them into the same tier. We'll rank them. Left is the higher rated, to the right is the lower rated. So if you're on the same line, if you're to the left, I think you're a better character than if you're to the right. Jadzia. Jadzia started off pretty strong, weak actually, right? Her performance was wooden. The actress wasn't sure what was going on. The writers weren't sure how to write this character. It was a good idea, the Trill character, but they never really, all the way through 7 seasons of the show, never really understood what the Trill were or what we were supposed to think about them. And therefore, they weren't really able to write them good stories after a while, because if you don't know what the character is about, it's difficult to make anything sort of convincing story-wise for them. I think Jadzia actually ends up right in the C tier. She was not great when she started, but once they figured her out and made her a little bit of a consigliere to Cisco, and then put her in a relationship with Worf, my favorite Star Trek relationship, Worf and Jadzia, I think that she settled into somewhere that she was like a reliable secondary character to have on the show, but she never really got anywhere above and beyond that level. So I'll stick her to a C. Odo. Odo is one of the best Star Trek characters ever created, right? So I'm going to pop him up here to the A tier. It's a great actor compared with a great character, and we started off with Odo learning about his authoritarian ways, how he's like sort of he's a man of rules, and he believes in justice and all that stuff. And once we met the founders, it all made more sense where Odo was coming from. And after that, it was kind of him trying to buck the trend of what he felt as a person, and what his culture was, and what his history was, and what his people or whatever expected him to be. And he's the character of Spock and Data, the character that's trying to become more human, although he's a little bit more reticent than either of those characters were towards that. And obviously by the end of the series, he goes home and back to the other changelings. But it's a great performance where Aubergine Genois was able to get through 5 pounds of latex on this guy's face and sort of emote with it. And he was funny. He had great banter with Quark. He had a relationship with Kira that we're going to kind of forget about. And even though that relationship took him and Kira off the map for a little bit in the 6th and 7th seasons, I still think he's one of the best, one of the most interesting characters that Star Trek's ever had, and one of the best performances that Star Trek has ever had. So therefore, he sits in the A tier comfortably. Garak. I like Garak. I always think Garak's like a little overrated somehow. Like he's kind of an In the Pale Moonlight thing where I understand why people really like it, but I have a hard time saying Garak is the best character on this show, just like I have a hard time saying that Pale Moonlight is the best DS9 episode far and away. Garak's good. It's a good performance. It's an interesting performance. Like the subtext to the Garak character is really interesting. He is, I don't know, like as much as I like him, I always find that Garak's language is kind of like a flowery excuse for nothing a lot of the time. That sounds kind of harsh. And that is what he's supposed to be. I don't know. There's something about Garak that doesn't really sit with me well, even though I can 100% understand why he's so important to the series. And if I'm ranking him there, he's super important to the series because he's the character who is necessary for spurring a lot of the other characters to action in ways that they don't want to be pushed. And because of that, he's vital to the whole philosophy of Deep Space Nine and how it compares to the other Star Trek series. So as much as I think that he is an A tier, I think he's just on the lower end of the A tier for me. So I'm going to put him up here next to Odo for now. Ezri Dax, we'll put her next to Jadzia for now. Is there any upside to Ezri is the problem. When Jadzia died, they brought in Ezri, and they wanted to wrap up the Worf storyline most of all. That seemed to be her primary function. And she didn't leave the station at that point. We talked about it on the podcast, how Ezri probably should have left after the first couple episodes of the final season and moved off, and we never saw the Dax symbiont again. They didn't do that. She stuck around. She had 3 pretty horrible episodes devoted to her in the middle of season 7, and then she kind of redeemed herself by the end of season 7. At the same time, she's kind of a pointless character, but she does have some good. It's a good performance. It felt like understandable that they would try to bring back Ezri because it is a character that you can resurrect because of the symbiont. I'm gonna put her on the D tier right here. She's not quite enough. I don't think she's a total failure of a character. She has a lot of bad moments, but you do see what they were trying to do with her, even if I don't think it worked really whatsoever. Dukat. Dukat's a tough one. Dukat is A+ material for 5.5 seasons or whatever, like midway through season 6, I think around Waltz or Wrongs Darker Than Death or Nights is when he is at his peak. The first time you start to get inklings that things might not be going well for him are in Covenant in the 7th season, and then after that he has probably one of the worst storylines in the entire series, where his final chapter arc where he recruits Tywin to do something with the power race is laughably awful. And it's a shame because he's so great prior to that. I'm going to put him on a B, a very high B, just because of the last season of Dukat, which is really, really bad. He's really, really excellent before that, though, so he's probably the highest B that you're going to get out of any of the other characters, but he is just a shade off of the A tier, which is too bad because he was one of Star Trek's greatest villains for those first 6 seasons, and then the 7th season is just a complete disaster in terms of what that character was supposed to be. Worf, any character that DS9 brought over from TNG became better on DS9. Worf was a B on DS9, and he's a B on DS9, but everything's relative here. He's a B on TNG, he's a B on DS9. And I really like Worf. I think that Worf is one of the stronger, not great characters, which is no shade against him because there's a ton of Star Trek characters. Worf is really, really solid. I think that Dorn, after 50 years of playing the character, eventually got him to a place where everything felt like old leather. It was very comfortable. Did Picard say that? I think Picard said that. He says that in Measure of a Man, which we just watched. That's why it's on my brain. I like Worf. I think Worf is really good. He's just not that exciting of a character, maybe. And after 300 Worf episodes, you kind of get the point of him. Even though I think DS9 brought him to a really great point by the end of it, and it really knew what to do with the character, he's still a B for me, a very solid B, and one of the better characters on the show, but he's still not one of the top tier. Lita. There's nothing really wrong with Lita, but there's really no reason for Lita to exist. So I'm going to put her in the F tier. Lita's fine, I guess. They never really did anything, and I actually had in my mind's eye before this last podcast run through that she was more important than she is. She really doesn't do anything. She has a enormous set of breasts. She plays the Dabo girl role, and she marries Rom. And there's nothing really wrong with her. Do I have to? I guess I'll give her. She'll be a low D tier, I think. She's not that bad that she deserves an F. I'll put her on the low D. What a horrible tier for this Dabo girl to end up on. Quark. There's not a lot of Quark in DS9. Was the surprising thing about this podcast, the podcast watch through. Quark is a very good performance that I think I liked early, and then eventually Shimmerman got a job on Buffy, and he was not on the show as much. And he kind of faded away a little bit. They always brought him in when they needed an alien to come in and say what was wrong with humanity, like why humanity was speaking too proudly, or why humanity was holding itself up on this pedestal that it wasn't really deserved. And he was always great in those moments, but it was like once a season that happened. I do like early Quark. I think early Quark and Odo is probably one of the best parts of the show for the first couple seasons. And it's too bad that they got away from that. But Quark's going to be a C character. Every Ferengi episode is awful, so that's really working against him. He's an excellent performance, and eventually he has some really high points, but I don't think he's consistent enough to be in the B tier because too many of the Ferengi episodes are so bad. I'll put him on the C tier. I think he's better. He's a better character than Jadzia, so I'll bump him up like that. Jake Sisko. Jake's an interesting one. The Visitor is his high point, clearly. And he doesn't really have a lot of low points. He's not beaten over the head. He doesn't beat the audience over the head in the way that Wesley did. I think he's another C tier. And I think he's actually at the back end of all of these. I'd rather have these two than see another Jake episode. There's not a lot to say about Jake. He fleshes out Sisko more than anything, more than he is his own character. I don't mind him. I don't really have a problem with him, but I'm not excited about a Jake episode outside of The Visitor. So I think a C, at the bottom of the C tier, feels appropriate. So now we got Cassidy Yates. Cassidy Yates. This might be a top-heavy list. This is probably the strength of the series shining through, right? Like, I can't think of anything really bad to say about Cassidy. I don't think she's a bad character. She was a utility more than anything to show Cisco in a new relationship, and you don't get a lot of time with Cassidy outside of seeing her through Cisco's eyes. I don't think she's bad. I think she's probably exactly the same as Jake, really, in that case. I think maybe Jake, because Jake has the Visitor, he'll be a little bit higher, but I'll put Cassidy Yates at the back end of this C here, and I think that feels appropriate for her. Keiko. Well, the O'Brien experiment was a horrible disaster on DS9. They brought on Miles, and then they said, well, bring your family too, obviously, because you love them, and it'll give us a lot of family material that we can write around. And they didn't really do any of that. I think Keiko is the first F character that we're going to have here. And this is largely part of the entire O'Brien problem, really. It's just a failed execution. The writers never wrote that family like they knew what a family was or how people in a relationship talk to each other. The performances are very stilted around each other. They abandoned them eventually, and they just paired up O'Brien with Bashir, and were like, you two can be friends now because your family is so awful, Miles. So Keiko's at the bottom. Started off with a lot of screen time and eventually turned into nothing. But her and Molly really just didn't do anything to help elevate Miles O'Brien, unfortunately. So I'm going to have to put her as our first F tier. Kira. Kira's one of the best Star Trek characters again. She's certainly one of the strongest female characters, I think, across all of the Star Trek series. She's going to be the A. I'm going to bump her ahead of Garak. Put her right there. Kira had a full arc in season 1, and then just kind of continued to have really strong episodes and really strong performances for the rest of the series. Eventually she got in a relationship with Odo, and that kind of screwed everything up, at least in terms of keeping them as unique characters that you wanted to see, or that the show wanted to trot out every once in a while. So despite the fact that the relationship kind of killed their momentum, and the fact that Kira was in a lot of awful, stupid relationships that were not intentionally written bad, it doesn't seem, but were just instead a failed idea of female characters need to be in relationships on Star Trek at all times, and they just paired her with some awful characters. But outside of that, every other story and every other thing that Kira ever had to do is really fantastic, and she's a great leader of this Bajoran aspect of the show. She has a lot of flexibility and nuance to her positions. It's hard to pin her to anything. She's a complicated character. And I think the performance is really strong. And I think that she's definitely one of the most important characters on this show. Miles O'Brien. Miles. I famously said he's the worst main cast character on DS9, and I think that's true. That was combining Ezri and Jadzia. I'd rather see an O'Brien episode than an Ezri episode. I'd rather see O'Brien than Lita, I think. But if you take away Ezri, O'Brien is probably the worst main cast character. For all the reasons that I talked about with Keiko here, it's just they wrote him incorrectly. They wrote the family badly. And then they instead of giving him his distinct personality, they paired him with O'Brien and Bashir, and kind of forgot to develop him as an independent character. He was attached to Bashir at the hip for the last couple seasons, and as fine as that was, it didn't really do him any favors as a character. He also tended to have the Beverly Crusher thing, where he got all the weird plots that didn't seem to quite fit anybody else, or if everyone else had a plot recently, they're like, well, give O'Brien something and it just randomly will fit in. Like, there's that episode he's the undercover cop. There's the episode he gets he does like the Inner Light, basically, where he does like a B-rate version of the Inner Light. he just felt like he was sort of randomly inserted into things, and he never really felt like he fit in with the rest of the crew or the characters in a smooth way. He was always a little bit outside of that for some reason, in my opinion, and it's too bad because I like the performance, but the character just isn't the great shakes that you'd expect. Morn. Went to D. Like, Morn's a fine one joke thing every once in a while. The episode that was dedicated to Morn, Who Mourns for Morn, is fine. That's a C- of an episode. So I'm going to put him at the D spot. I think Morn as a joke is better than Lita as a joke. So I'm going to put them like that. I think that's right for me. Morn's a novelty character, so it's difficult to rank him. Now we've got Nog. One of the stronger developments, right? Along with Damar, Nog is probably one of the strongest definitive changes of a character that you see across the whole series, where he starts out as like a little Ferengi punk who pairs up with Jake to commit mild crime around the station. Eventually he joins Starfleet and then gets his leg shot off and then becomes the war hero. And yeah, I like Nog. I think Nog is a weak B. He's probably at the back end of the Bs. I do like him. I think he suffers just for being a Ferengi, honestly. I think I'm going to hold that against him. But outside of that, I think that he's really strong. His character arc is really fantastic. He has some good episodes with the Holosuite towards the end in the not in the Pale Moonlight, the Paper Moon. And yeah, I think low B is appropriate for him. So now we got his dad. Got his dad, Rom. Rom is a worse character than those two. Rom is a worse character than all of these. Rom goes down here somewhere. I actually like seeing Lita and Morn more than I like seeing Rom, I think. So I've decided to put him at the end of the D list. He's a Ferengi. Again, that counts against them. That's almost unfair, but it is what they are, and their storylines are really awful. He never really developed as his own character. He was always paired with Quark and Nog, and that was fine. That was the trifecta that made the Ferengi family on the station. But he's probably my least favorite of those Ferengi. And so I think at the bottom of the D tier makes sense for him here. Sisko. Sisko's not an A character. He's the first captain to not be an A character on the show, I think. The performance is a little weird. I like Sisko. I think they eventually wrote Sisko appropriately. Brooks continued to really sometimes torpedo scenes when he decided that he wanted to start acting. And that was always a downside to the Sisko thing. You were never really, we made a joke on the podcast, you were never really sure as a writer on the show what Avery Brooks was going to give you when you wrote him something. He never became predictable, which is a positive in some ways, but a negative in a lot of ways. And I think that in the Pale Moonlight is actually knocked down a bit by his performance in some of the scenes. Just because I think he takes it a little bit too far and he doesn't play the emotion that I think Sisko is feeling appropriately. Sisko's also interesting as a captain who is fairly backgrounded compared to Picard and Kirk. You almost don't think of him first when you think of the series. Unlike Kirk and Picard, who sort of immediately pop to mind when you think of TOS and TNG. I'm going to put Sisko up here. I think Sisko is in between Worf and Nog. I think I like Worf's arc a little bit better. Worf has a cleaner story throughout DS9. The Sisko thing, the emissary role, really tanks Sisko a little bit more. I think he handles it better than Dukat did, but he is... not blameless or not, he doesn't escape like the problems of that storyline. So I think that's fair. I think putting Sisko there towards the back end of the B tier is good. Then we got O'Brien. Not O'Brien. Why do I keep calling him O'Brien? His name is Bashir. His name is Julian Bashir. Bashir is a character who improved quite a bit. He's similar to Nog in that he started off kind of odd, or he's similar to Jadzia in that the performance and the writing were not really great for him early. Not that I don't find his character problematic, if you want to use that term, in terms of like he's kind of a young doctor who's coming, he's hitting on the ladies, and he's trying to be an adventurer on the final frontier. And I don't really find that annoying or poor writing. I think that's what Bashir was when he came out of Starfleet or got his first assignment on DS9. But he eventually turned into something really interesting. And once they did the genetic testing or genetic enhancement thing, he calmed down as a character. He definitely matured the most out of everybody. And by the end of it, with episodes like Into Arma, he's really the face of Roddenberry, standing up for the Roddenberry thing in this universe of DS9, which is a really interesting conflict for that character to have. So he's got the optimism of TNG, but he's in this DS9 world, which is slightly cynical at the same time. And when he eventually calmed down, matured, and got paired with O'Brien, which I think maybe didn't help O'Brien as much as it helped Bashir, and he had his thing with Garak, and I think that he just turned out to be in a really good place after a while. He is a lower tier here. I think I'm going to put him behind Cisco, but he's a fairly solid character, in my opinion. But he'll go there at the B. And then finally, Tywin, who is an F. The only one good moment I think that Tywin had was that time she had an episode where she talked to Kira about she never gave up the faith while the Cardassians were beating her during the occupation, and she was still preaching and refused to give in. Outside of that, though, it's a very wooden, strange performance, like all the Bajoran Vedics are. Little characterization to her beyond power-hungry, crazy person. She's not crazy, but she's power-hungry and duplicitous, I guess. And she's also paired with Dukat in the final arc, which is awful for both of them. And I never feel that Tywin really got a firm foothold on what her character was and what she was trying to do. It was always just a vaguely evil Vedic or Kai who would come to the station every once in a while. And it just wasn't good enough. Compared to other characters who went through like solid development, Tywin always felt like a little bit of a mystery that the writers weren't sure what her ultimate goals were. And therefore, she just kind of flutters around with these bad plots going on. And I think she's worse than Keiko. I think she's the worst character on this list. So that's it. Let's see if I need to reorganize any of these guys. Odo, Kira, and Garak seems about right. Dukat at the top, then Worf, Cisco, Bashir. That's about right. Would I put... I think I'd actually put Jadzia above Quark. I'd rather have Jake than Cassidy Yates. This feels wrong that O'Brien is worse than Cassidy Yates. I don't know about that. I'm gonna move her. This is the weirdest part of this ranking. This Jake Cassidy O'Brien thing. I think this is okay. Do I want to move Cassidy somewhere? I think that's appropriate, maybe. These are very close, these two. Like the difficult thing about ranking these guys is that they have totally different roles, Jake and O'Brien. But I do feel that O'Brien is a worse character than Jake is, even though Jake doesn't have as many moments to prove that he's a bad character. I think the rest of these are good. So we got Cassidy, then Ezri, then these forgettable three, and Keiko and Tywin at the bottom. Yeah, I think that's it. That's my ranking. Guys, thank you very much for listening. Hopefully you enjoyed it. Let me know what you think. What did I get wrong? What did I get right? What does your list look like? Who's your top and your bottom here? That's it. Thank you very much for listening. Check out the podcast at thepenskypodcast.com. Going through every single Star Trek episode. They're also on YouTube. If you're so inclined, you can just check out the channel here and you can find those podcasts. We're going through every single episode of Star Trek, talking about them. We've made it through DS9, TNG, and TOS, and we're on Picard right now at the time of this video posting. And that's about it. Cool. Thank you very much for listening. See you later.